Imagine taking a quiet evening off, enjoying a swim in your own pool, only to be confronted, humiliated, and treated like a trespasser in your own home. But the real kicker? The one doing the accusing has no idea who you are. This is the story of how one entitled woman learned a lesson she would never forget. Like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will make your jaw drop. It was a warm summer evening in Oak Ridge, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the houses were large, the lawns were perfectly manicured, and the people, well, most of them, lived under the illusion that they knew everything about everyone. The community pool, nestled in the center of the neighborhood, was a place for residents to relax, unwind, and escape the summer heat. It was an exclusive amenity accessible only to those who lived in the neighborhood. Chief Daniel Hayes had lived in Oak Ridge for nearly a decade. A dedicated police officer, he had risen through the ranks, earning the respect of his peers and the admiration of those who knew him well. But here, in this affluent neighborhood, not everyone truly knew him. They saw his well-kept home, his expensive car, his presence at the occasional homeowners association meetings, but beyond that, he was just another face in the crowd. And to some, particularly those with narrow minds and entitled attitudes, he was a face that didn't belong. That evening, after a grueling day at work, Daniel decided to unwind. He changed into his swim trunks, grabbed a towel, and headed to the community pool. As he walked past the iron gate and stepped onto the pool deck, the scent of chlorine and the distant laughter of children filled the air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the water. A few families were scattered around, some lounging on chairs, others waiting in the shallow end. Daniel sighed in relief. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was a few peaceful laps before heading home. He placed his towel on a nearby chair and lowered himself into the cool water. With smooth, practiced strokes, he glided across the pool, the tension in his muscles slowly fading away. And that's when he heard it. A sharp, indignant voice cut through the calm evening air like a knife. "Excuse me. What do you think you're doing here?" Daniel paused mid-stroke, lifting his head above the water. At the edge of the pool stood a woman, blonde, mid-40s, arms crossed over her chest, a scowl etched deep into her features. She wore an expensive-looking sun hat, designer sunglasses, and a swimsuit that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly grocery bill. He didn't recognize her personally, but he knew the type. Ignoring the growing irritation in his chest, Daniel calmly wiped the water from his face and looked up at her. "Excuse me." The woman huffed, her lips pursing as if she had just bitten into something sour. "I said, what are you doing here? This is a private pool, residents only." Daniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He glanced around. There were other people in the pool, white families enjoying their evening, not a single one being questioned. Yet here he was, standing waist-deep in water, being interrogated like some sort of intruder. He forced a polite smile. "I am a resident." The woman scoffed, adjusting her sunglasses as if she needed a better look at him. "I don't think so," she said, shaking her head. "I know all the homeowners in this community, and I've never seen you before." Daniel sighed inwardly. He had dealt with people like her before. The type who assumed their perception of the world was the absolute truth. The type who felt emboldened to question, control, and dictate who was allowed where. He could have argued, could have stated his address, but something in him told him to wait, to see just how far she would take this. He took a step closer, keeping his voice measured. "And you are?" The woman raised her chin. "Karen Wilkins. I'm on the Homeowners Association board." Daniel almost laughed. Of course, her name was Karen. "Well, Karen," he said, maintaining eye contact, "I live here. Have for years." Karen's eyes narrowed. She wasn't buying it. "Oh, really? Where exactly do you live?" Daniel arched an eyebrow. "I don't think I need to share my address with you." Karen's expression darkened. "You most certainly do if you want to stay here. We have rules in this neighborhood, and one of them is keeping trespassers out." She looked around as if expecting backup from the other residents. A few glanced in their direction, but most seemed uncomfortable, unwilling to get involved. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had come here to relax, not to argue with an entitled woman on a power trip. But before he could respond, Karen pulled out her phone. "I don't have time for this. I'm calling security." Daniel clenched his jaw. Karen pressed the screen aggressively, then lifted the phone to her ear. "Hello? Yes, this is Karen Wilkins from the Oak Ridge HOA. We have a situation at the community pool. There's a suspicious individual here who refuses to leave. No, he's still in the water. I told him this is private property, but he's being difficult." She glanced at Daniel, her expression smug. "Yes, please send someone immediately." Daniel's patience was wearing thin. He wasn't just a resident. He was the police chief. And if there was one thing he knew, it was how people like Karen operated. They used authority as a weapon, bending rules to fit their own biases. But what Karen didn't realize was that the very authority she was calling upon to remove him was him. He could have revealed the truth right then and there. Could have pulled out his badge, shut her down, and watched the color drain from her face. But no, not yet. Let's see how far she takes this. Karen stood by the pool, her phone still pressed to her ear, her lips curled in smug satisfaction. The way she held herself a chin high, eyes sharp, made it clear that she fully expected the situation to unfold in her favor. In her mind, she had already won. Soon, security would arrive and this trespasser would be escorted out like the criminal she imagined him to be. Daniel, still standing waist-deep in the water, watched her closely. He had encountered her type more times than he could count, people who thought they owned not just their homes but the very space around them. They wielded their sense of entitlement like a weapon, using rules as an excuse to justify their biases. But what Karen didn't realize was that her call to security was about to backfire in a way she never could have predicted. A few people around the pool had taken notice, some exchanging glances, others awkwardly avoiding the situation altogether. No one dared to intervene. Some looked uncomfortable, clearly aware that something was off, but they remained silent, either out of fear or indifference. Daniel took a deep breath, keeping his expression neutral. He wasn't about to let Karen's arrogance ruin his evening. Karen ended her call and crossed her arms. "Security will be here any minute," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You might want to start gathering your things." Daniel tilted his head. "And what exactly do you think they're going to do?" Karen let out a laugh, short and sharp. "They're going to remove you from the premises. This is private property. You don't belong here." Daniel's patience was wearing thin. He had never been one to escalate situations unnecessarily, but Karen was pushing every possible button. He took a step forward, resting his arms on the edge of the pool as he looked up at her. "And if I do belong here?" he asked. Karen scoffed. "That's not possible." "Why?" Her jaw tightened. She faltered for just a second, then quickly recovered. "Because I know all the homeowners in this community and I've never seen you before." Daniel gave her a long, steady look. "Maybe you don't know as much as you think you do." Karen's nostrils flared, and before she could respond, the gate to the pool creaked open. Two uniformed security guards stepped in, their expressions professional but cautious. One of them, a stocky man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed mustache, recognized Daniel immediately. His posture stiffened as his eyes widened slightly in surprise. Daniel had worked with Oak Ridge Security before. While they weren't under his direct command, they often coordinated with the police department on neighborhood concerns. The guard's name was Mike, and though they weren't close, they were certainly familiar with each other. Karen turned to the guards, her entire demeanor shifting into full-on authority mode. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man refuses to leave. He's trespassing on private property." Mike blinked, glancing between Karen and Daniel. He hesitated. Ma'am." Karen didn't let him finish. "I called because this pool is for residents only. I caught him sneaking in, and he refused to tell me where he lives. I don't know what his intentions are, but we can't just let anyone wander in here." Mike gave Daniel a look. One that silently asked, "How do you want to handle this?" Daniel remained quiet, watching Karen dig herself deeper into a hole. The second guard, a younger man in his early 30s, looked uncomfortable. He turned to Daniel. "Sir, do you, live here?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Karen. "You seem pretty confident about this," he said. "You're absolutely sure I don't belong here?" Karen rolled her eyes. "I don't need to be sure. You refuse to prove otherwise, which means you're lying." Daniel chuckled. "You know, it's funny," he said, shaking his head. "You're so certain that I don't belong here, yet you never stopped to consider the possibility that I do. That maybe, just maybe, you're the one making a mistake." Karen let out a scoff. "Oh, please." She turned back to the security guards. "Are you going to do your job or not?" Mike shifted uncomfortably. He knew he had to say something before Karen embarrassed herself further. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Karen's eyebrows shot up. "Misunderstanding? What misunderstanding?" Mike hesitated, but then Daniel spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "The misunderstanding," he said, stepping out of the pool and reaching for his towel, "is that you assumed I don't belong here." He dried his face and turned to her. "But I do. In fact, I've lived here for almost 10 years. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. That's not. There's no way. Daniel held up a hand. Let me finish, he said. Not only do I live here, but I'm also someone you really don't want to be making false accusations against. He reached into the pocket of his towel, pulled out his wallet, and flipped it open. A gleaming police badge stared back at Karen. Silence fell over the pool area. The second security guard's eyes widened. Mike let out a quiet sigh, clearly relieved that Daniel had taken control of the situation himself. Karen, however, was frozen in place. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her eyes darted from the badge to Daniel's face, then back to the badge. I'm Chief Daniel Hayes, he said evenly. Chief of Police. Karen's breath hitched. And before you try to backpedal, he continued, I know what you were trying to do here. You assumed I was an outsider. You assumed I didn't belong, not because of anything I did, but because of how I look. Karen's face turned red. I didn't. Daniel raised a hand, stopping her. Save it. His voice was cool, controlled. You called security on the chief of police without a single shred of evidence. Just your assumptions. Karen swallowed hard, her previous arrogance melting into something close to panic. I was just trying to follow the rules. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. No, you weren't. You were trying to enforce your version of the rules. And in doing so, you just made one of the biggest mistakes of your life. Karen's lips trembled. I didn't mean. Didn't mean to what? Daniel's gaze locked onto hers. Didn't mean to get caught? Karen took a step back, her entire body language shifting. The reality of the situation was sinking in. But Daniel wasn't done yet, because what was about to happen next would change everything. Karen stood frozen, her face drained of color as the weight of her mistake settled in. The smugness, the superiority gone. In its place was a growing panic, an unspoken plea for a way out. But there was no escape from the truth. She had called security on the chief of police, the very person responsible for law and order in this town, simply because she had assumed he didn't belong. The air around the pool was thick with tension. Parents hushed their children, a few neighbors exchanged glances, some watching with quiet satisfaction while others simply looked uncomfortable. The security guards, caught in the middle of the unfolding disaster, waited in awkward silence, unsure if they should intervene or let Daniel handle the situation. Daniel took a step forward, his presence commanding. Tell me, Karen, he said, his voice low and steady, what exactly were you hoping would happen? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. Did you want me dragged out in handcuffs? Daniel pressed. Did you want me humiliated? Locked up? Maybe even worse? Karen shook her head furiously. And no. Then what? His voice sharpened. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you weren't trying to enforce the rules. You were trying to enforce your version of who belongs and who doesn't. Karen's lips trembled. I just thought. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You thought what? She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the straps of her designer swimsuit cover. I thought you were a stranger. Daniel let out a bitter chuckle. A stranger? In the neighborhood I've lived in for almost a decade. He shook his head. No, Karen. Be honest. You didn't think I was a stranger. You thought I didn't belong here. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for backup, but none of the other residents came to her defense. She was on her own. I didn't mean any harm, she said weakly. Daniel's expression hardened. Didn't mean any harm? He gestured toward the security guards. You called them on me. You labeled me suspicious. Do you have any idea how dangerous that could have been? How many times calls like this have led to innocent people being hurt or even killed? Karen flinched, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Daniel wasn't done. People like you, he said, his tone cold, think that just because you live in a nice neighborhood, you get to decide who belongs and who doesn't. You don't see yourselves as the problem. But you are. Karen took a shaky step back. I swear, I didn't mean to. Daniel held up a hand, silencing her. You meant every word, he said. You were so sure that I was in the wrong. You assumed I was lying about living here. And now that you realize your mistake, you want to act like it was just a simple misunderstanding. Karen's breath hitched. I could report you for this, Daniel continued. Do you know that? False accusations, wasting security's time. I could have you written up in the HOA. Hell, I could make sure you're banned from this very pool. Karen paled even further. No, please. I didn't mean. Daniel let the words hang between them before sighing. He didn't want to waste another second on this entitled woman. He turned to the security guards. "We done here?" Mike, the older guard, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Daniel nodded. "Good." He then turned back to Karen, whose entire body was rigid with fear. "I'm not going to report you," he said, his voice softer now but still firm. "Not because you don't deserve it, but because I want you to think about what just happened here. About how quickly you jumped to conclusions. About how easily this could have gone wrong." Karen blinked rapidly as if struggling to process everything. Daniel took a deep breath and turned away. He was done. He picked up his towel, slung it over his shoulder, and walked toward the gate. But just as he reached it, he stopped and glanced back. "You're lucky," he said. "Because next time, the person you do this to might not be as patient as me." And with that, he pushed the gate open and walked away, leaving Karen standing there shaken, speechless, and completely exposed for who she really was. But little did Daniel know this wasn't over. Not yet. Because Karen wasn't the type to admit when she was wrong. She was the type to get even. The evening air was cool as Daniel walked back toward his townhouse, but his mind was still burning from what had just happened. He had dealt with situations like this before, more times than he could count, but something about this one left a bitter taste in his mouth. Maybe it was the sheer arrogance in Karen's voice or the fact that even when caught, she couldn't bring herself to truly admit she was wrong. He had let it go, but deep down, he knew people like her didn't just let things go. And he was right. The trouble started the next morning. Daniel was getting ready to leave for the station when his phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it and frowned. A message from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. "Urgent community notice. Unauthorized individual at the pool." Daniel's stomach tightened. He clicked the message and his jaw clenched as he read the next line. "A recent security report has identified an unknown man accessing the community pool without proper verification. Residents are encouraged to report any suspicious activity. Remember, community safety is our top priority." Below it was a blurry, zoomed-in image of him at the pool last night. Daniel inhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the phone. Karen. She wasn't done after all. She had gone to the HOA and spun the story her way, turning him into a threat instead of the victim. And worse, she had done it in a way that didn't name him outright, but still put a target on his back. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had options. He could go straight to the HOA board, demand a retraction. He could call a legal team. He could even expose Karen in front of the entire community. But something told him she wasn't going to stop there. And within hours, that suspicion was confirmed. By noon, Daniel started getting looks. At the grocery store, a neighbor he had known for years gave him a hesitant nod but quickly looked away. A jogger who usually waved every morning barely acknowledged him. And then there was the older couple at the mailbox, whispering to each other as he walked by, their eyes full of something between curiosity and doubt. Karen's little stunt had planted a seed. Daniel knew exactly what she was doing, turning the power of whispers against him. She hadn't won at the pool, so she was waging a different kind of war. One where she didn't need proof. Just suggestion. And it didn't take long before she made her next move. That evening, as Daniel arrived home, he saw a letter taped to his front door. His eyes narrowed as he pulled it off and read the words in bold print. Notice of investigation, HOA Compliance Committee. Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. Karen had officially filed a complaint against him. He shook his head, running a hand over his face. This was no longer just about an argument by the pool. This was about Karen trying to push him out. And she had no idea just how badly she was about to lose. Daniel stared at the letter in his hands, his jaw tightening. Karen had escalated this beyond a petty argument. She was trying to paint him as a problem in his own neighborhood. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. He wasn't just some guy she could push around. He was chief of police. And he was about to show her exactly what that meant. The confrontation. The next morning, Daniel took the letter and walked straight to the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association office. He had no appointment, but when he stepped through the doors, the receptionist immediately stiffened in recognition. I need to speak to whoever is handling this so-called investigation, Daniel said, holding up the notice. The receptionist hesitated. I believe Mr. Holloway, our HOA president, is overseeing that. Good, Daniel said. Tell him I'll wait. A few minutes later, an older man in a tailored suit walked out, a polite but cautious smile on his face. Chief Hayes, he said, offering a handshake. I assume this is about the compliance notice? Daniel didn't return the smile. Let's not waste time, Mr. Holloway. Why am I under investigation? Holloway sighed, gesturing for Daniel to follow him into his office. Once the door shut, he leaned against his desk. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. Karen Whitman came to us yesterday with concerns. Daniel folded his arms. Concerns? Holloway nodded. She claimed there was an unauthorized individual at the pool, and while we now understand that it was a misunderstanding. Daniel cut him off. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination. And now she's using you and the HOA to continue harassing me. Holloway sighed again, rubbing his temples. Chief, Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and firm. Do you know what happens when someone files a false report? Holloway swallowed. Well, the HOA has procedures, but I'm not talking about HOA procedures, Daniel said. I'm talking about legal consequences. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through messages, landing on a forwarded email from the city attorney, one he had requested first thing that morning. He turned the screen to face Holloway. This is a formal request for review, Daniel said. If Karen continues spreading false claims, it becomes a legal issue. Slander. Defamation. And if the HOA enables it, you could be held responsible too. Holloway's face paled. Chief, we certainly don't want that. Then here's what's going to happen, Daniel said. You're going to issue a statement correcting this entire mess. You're going to send out an HOA-wide email explaining that I am a resident here, that the accusations were false, and that no one should be targeted based on assumptions. Holloway hesitated. Karen won't be happy about that. Daniel smiled coldly. I don't care. Karen gets what she deserves. By that evening, an official HOA email had gone out clearing Daniel's name and publicly stating that the report was unfounded and inappropriate. But that wasn't all. Karen wasn't expecting what happened next. She had assumed she was safe, that even if Daniel pushed back, she could play the victim. But she underestimated one thing: people were watching. Within hours, neighbors who had once given Daniel skeptical glances were now glaring at Karen. Conversations whispered behind hands now spoke against her. And then came the final blow. At the next HOA meeting, several residents, fed up with her behavior, formally filed complaints against her. For harassment. For spreading false rumors. For creating a hostile environment. Karen wasn't just exposed. She was voted out of the HOA board. Her power? Gone. Her influence? Shattered. And as Daniel walked past her a few days later at the community pool where she now sat alone, no one wanting to be associated with her, he simply gave her a polite nod. She looked away, her face burning with humiliation. Because she knew. She had tried to tear him down. And instead, she had destroyed herself. The end.